I learned that night that kindness doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right person to notice. The rain had already soaked through my sneakers by the time I saw him. A man slumped against the side of a flickering bus stop bench like part of the city everyone else had agreed not to see, and people passed him in steady lines, umbrellas tilted, eyes forward, like he wasn't there, like he didn't matter, and for a second I almost did the same because I was tired, because my shift had run 12 hours instead of 8, because my feet hurt and my phone was at 3% and I still had half a mile to walk to my apartment. But then he moved, just slightly, and it was enough to break that invisible rule everyone else seemed so comfortable following. So I stopped, my breath catching as the cold wind cut through my jacket, and I knelt beside him, ignoring the way water seeped into my jeans, ignoring the looks from strangers who slowed just enough to judge me before continuing on. "Hey," I whispered, my voice softer than the rain tapping against the metal roof above us. "Can you hear me?" He didn't answer, but his breathing was there, shallow but steady, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my hands trembling a little as I adjusted the thin blanket draped over his shoulders, the kind you get from a shelter if you're lucky, the kind that doesn't do much against a night like this. "You're okay," I said, even though I had no idea if that was true, even though I wasn't sure why I was saying it. Maybe for him, maybe for me, and I reached into my bag, pulling out the sandwich I'd saved from work, the one I was supposed to eat on the walk home, and I placed it gently beside him, pressing it into his hand until his fingers curled weakly around it. And that's when I felt it, not a sound, not a movement, just a shift, like the air itself had changed, and I looked up without thinking, across the street where a black SUV sat idling under a streetlight, sleek and out of place against the cracked pavement and dim storefronts, its windows dark but not empty. Because I knew, somehow, instinctively, that someone was watching, and for a moment I froze, my heart stuttering in my chest as I held that gaze I couldn't see, that presence I couldn't explain, and then I looked away because that's what people do, because you don't stare into darkness and expect it to stare back. But the feeling didn't leave. It stayed, heavy and quiet, like a weight pressing against my ribs, and I stood slowly, brushing rain from my hands, telling myself I was imagining things, telling myself it didn't matter because the man on the bench needed more than my imagination. He needed someone to stay. So I stayed, even as cars splashed past, even as the cold crept deeper into my bones, even as minutes stretched longer than they should. And when I finally stepped back, when I finally forced myself to leave because there was nothing more I could do, I didn't look at the SUV again. I didn't want to, I didn't need to, but I felt it, that same presence, still there, still watching. And as I turned the corner, disappearing into the blur of rain and streetlights, I didn't know that I had just broken a rule I didn't even realize existed. I didn't know that in a city full of people who walked away, I had been the one who stopped, and somewhere behind me, in the quiet hum of an engine that hadn't moved, someone had noticed, and he didn't look away. The next morning, I told myself it had been nothing, just another long night in a city that never really stopped moving. Just another moment I would forget once the sun came up and real life took over, but the feeling stayed with me, quiet and persistent, like a shadow I could not quite see. And even as I stood behind the counter at the coffee shop, tying my apron with fingers that still felt stiff from the cold, I caught myself glancing toward the windows more than usual, like I expected to. See that same black SUV waiting across the street, engine running, someone inside watching, but there was nothing there, just the usual morning rush, people in suits ordering double espressos, college students staring at their phones, the normal rhythm of a world that had no time for hesitation, and I almost laughed at myself for thinking it had meant anything at all until the bell above the door chimed and everything changed without anyone else noticing. Because he did not walk in like a customer, he did not hesitate or look around or check the menu like everyone else. He just entered like he already owned the space, like the air itself moved out of his way, and I felt it before I saw him. That same shift from the night before, that same quiet pressure in my chest. And when I looked up, really looked this time, I knew. I knew in a way that did not need logic or explanation. It was him, the one who had been watching, the one who had not looked away. And for a second I forgot how to breathe, forgot the order I was taking, forgot the line forming behind him, because his eyes were already on me, steady and unreadable, like he had been expecting to find me here all along. And maybe that should have scared me. Maybe it should have made me step back or call someone or pretend I had somewhere else to be. But I did not move. I just stood there with my hands resting on the counter, my heart beating louder than the grinder behind me, until the customer in front of him cleared his throat and reality snapped back into place. "What can I get for you?" I asked, my voice coming out softer than I intended, and he did not answer right away. Just held my gaze for a second longer than normal, long enough to make everything else feel distant, like we were the only two people in the room. And then he said, "Coffee." Simple, controlled, like the word carried more weight than it should, and I nodded, turning away too quickly as I reached for a cup, my hands betraying me with the slightest tremor as I filled it, telling myself to calm down, telling myself he was just another customer. But nothing about him felt ordinary. Not the way the room seemed quieter around him. Not the way people instinctively gave him space without knowing why. Not the way I could still feel his attention even with my back turned. And when I handed him the cup, our fingers brushed for just a second, barely anything. But it was enough to send a strange warmth through me that had nothing to do with the coffee. And I pulled my hand back, trying to ignore it, trying to pretend it had not happened. "That will be $3.50, I said, focusing on the register instead of his face, and he reached into his jacket, placing a bill on the counter without looking at it, without asking for change, like money was the least important part of this exchange. And when I glanced down, it was more than enough, too much. But when I looked back up to say something, to correct him, to hand it back, he was still there, still watching. And this time there was something different in his expression, not softer, not warmer, just certain, like he had already made a decision I was not part of. "Why did you stop?" he asked quietly, and the question hit me harder than it should have, because he was not asking about the coffee. He was asking about last night, about the man on the bench, about the moment everyone else had ignored, and I opened my mouth, hesitated, because I did not have a good answer, not one that made sense in a world that kept moving no matter who got left behind. But I said it anyway, the only truth I had, because I could not just walk away. And something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like those words had landed somewhere deeper than I expected, and he held my gaze for one more second before giving the smallest nod, like he understood something I did not, and then he turned and walked out without another word, leaving behind the untouched change on the counter and a silence that felt heavier than before. And as the door closed behind him, I realized my hands were still shaking, not from fear, not exactly, but from the quiet, impossible certainty that this was not over, that whatever had started in the rain the night before had followed me into the light, and this time, I had been the one who was seen. By the time my shift ended, I had convinced myself it had been a coincidence, a strange interaction layered on top of an already strange night, something I would file away and forget like everything else that did not quite make sense in this city. But that feeling refused to leave. It followed me as I wiped down counters, as I counted tips, as I untied my apron with hands that still did not feel completely steady, and when I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, I hesitated without knowing why, my eyes drifting across the street again, searching for something I told myself was not there, and for a moment I saw nothing, just passing cars and people moving too fast to notice anything beyond themselves, and then I saw it, parked half a block down like it had always been there, the same black SUV, quiet, still, waiting, and my breath caught before I could stop it. A small, involuntary reaction that made no sense because there was no reason for it to matter, no reason for him to still be here. And yet he was, and something inside me shifted, not fear exactly, not yet, but awareness, the kind that makes you stand a little straighter, walk a little faster, think a little harder about every step you take. So I told myself to ignore it, to keep moving, to go home like I always did, because whatever world he belonged to had nothing to do with mine, and I was not about to let a stranger change that. But the moment I stepped off the curb, I felt it again, that same quiet pressure, like eyes on my back, steady and unrelenting, and I did not turn around. I refused to, because turning would make it real, and I was not ready for that, not yet. So I walked, one block, then another, my heart beat louder than the traffic around me, until I reached the corner where the bus stop sat, the same one from last night, and, without thinking, I slowed, my gaze drifting to the bench, and he was gone, the man I had helped, gone without a trace. No blanket, no sign he had ever been there. Just empty space where something had mattered for a moment and then disappeared. And I felt a strange mix of relief and something else I could not quite name, something that lingered just beneath the surface, because I did not know if he was okay. I did not know if what I had done had made any difference at all, and that uncertainty settled into my chest heavier than I expected, until a voice broke through it, low and controlled, close enough that I felt it before I fully heard it. He is alive. And I turned this time, unable to stop myself, because I knew that voice, I knew that presence. And there he was, standing just a few feet away like he had always belonged there, like the space between us had never existed, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on mine with that same intensity that made everything else fade into the background. And for a second, I just stared, my mind catching up to the moment, trying to understand how he had moved so quietly, how he had closed the distance without me noticing. But the only thing that mattered was what he had said. "You know him?" I asked, my voice softer now, less steady than I wanted it to be, and he shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just certain. "No," he said, but I made sure someone checked on him. And the words settled between us, simple, direct, but carrying more weight than they should have, because it meant he had not just watched, he had acted, in his own way, in a way I had not seen. And something about that realization made my chest tighten, because it blurred the line I had been trying to draw between us, the line that said we were nothing alike, that we existed in completely separate worlds. "You did not have to do that," I said, and his gaze did not waver. "Neither did you," he replied, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The noise of the city filling the silence around us, cars passing, people talking, life continuing as if this moment was not unfolding right in the middle of it, but it was, and I could feel it shifting, changing into something I did not fully understand. Something I was not sure I wanted to understand, because understanding would mean accepting that this was real, that he was real, that whatever had started last night was not going to end with a simple goodbye. And then he took a small step closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough to make the distance feel intentional, controlled, like everything else about him. "You should be more careful," he said quietly, and there was no threat in his tone, no judgment, just a calm certainty that made the words land harder than if he had raised his voice, kindness-like. "Yours," he added after a brief pause, "does not go unnoticed by everyone." And I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, because I knew what he meant, even if he did not say it directly. And I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze, to hold it this time instead of looking away. "I am not afraid of helping people," I said, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there, like a flicker beneath the surface. "You should not be," he replied, his voice just as steady as before. "But you should understand who is watching when you do." And with that, he stepped back, breaking whatever invisible line had formed between us, turning as if the conversation was already over, as if he had said everything he needed to say. And I stood there for a second longer, my thoughts racing, my heart still trying to find a rhythm that made sense, because I realized something in that moment that I could not ignore anymore, something that settled deep and undeniable. The world had not changed overnight. People were still walking past things they did not want to see, still choosing convenience over care, but now there was someone who was watching me, someone who had noticed, and he was not looking away. I told myself I would forget him after that, that whatever strange gravity seemed to follow him would fade once I got far enough away. But the truth was it did not fade. It settled, like a quiet echo that kept repeating long after the original sound had disappeared. And that night, as I walked up the narrow stairs to my apartment, keys clutched tighter than usual in my hand, I caught myself listening for footsteps that were not there, glancing over my shoulder even when the hallway was empty. Not because I thought he would follow me, but because part of me wondered if he already had, and that thought should have scared me more than it did. But it did not. It just lingered, uncomfortable and undeniable, like a question I did not want to answer. And when I finally pushed my door open and stepped inside, the familiar space should have grounded me. The worn couch, the small kitchen, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Everything exactly where I left it, safe, ordinary, mine. But even there, the feeling stayed, faint but present, like something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. So I tried to ignore it. I changed out of my damp clothes, made something quick to eat, turned on the television just for noise, anything to drown out the thoughts that kept circling back to him, to the way he had looked at me, to the way he had said those words like they carried weight I did not understand, and while it worked, or at least I convinced myself it did, until there was a knock at my door, soft but deliberate, the kind that does not belong to someone lost or unsure, and my entire body went still, every instinct sharpening at once, because nobody knocked on my door at this hour, nobody who mattered, nobody who knew me well enough to come unannounced, and I stood there for a second longer than I should have, staring at the door like it might answer me first, before I moved slowly, carefully, my hand tightening around the edge of the frame as I leaned just enough to look through the peephole, and my breath caught again, not from fear this time, but from recognition, because it was not him, not the man who had been watching, but someone else, someone dressed too well for this building, standing too still, too composed, like he belonged somewhere else entirely, and that realization made something cold settle in my chest, because if he was not here by accident, then that meant this was not over, not even close, and I hesitated, every part of me telling me not to open that door, to pretend I was not home, to let whoever it was leave and take whatever this was with them. But my hand moved anyway, drawn by something I could not explain, and when I opened it just enough to see his face clearly, he offered a small, polite nod, like this was a normal interaction, like standing outside my door in the middle of the night made perfect sense. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm, controlled, and I felt a jolt of surprise at the sound of my name on his lips, because I had never told him, I had never told anyone connected to him. And yet here it was, spoken like fact, not question. "I have something for you," he continued, holding out a small paper bag, simple, unmarked, nothing about it standing out except the way he presented it, careful, deliberate, like it mattered more than it should, and I did not take it right away, my fingers curling slightly at my side as I searched his face for something that would explain this, something that would make it make sense. "From who?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Even though there was only one person this could lead back to, and the man's expression did not change, not even slightly, from someone who noticed, he replied, and the words settled into the space between us, quiet and final, and I swallowed, the weight of them pressing down in a way I could not ignore anymore, because this was no longer just a moment on the street, no longer just a conversation that could be forgotten. This had followed me home, crossed a line I had not realized existed, and I stood there for another second before finally reaching out, my fingers brushing the edge of the bag as I took it from him, the paper warm from his grip, grounding in a way I did not expect, and as soon as I had it, he stepped back, already turning to leave like his part in this was finished, like the delivery was the only thing that mattered, and I watched him go, my mind racing, my heart beating a little too fast for something that should have been simple, and when I closed the door and leaned against it, the quiet of my apartment felt different now, heavier, charged with something I could not ignore, and as I looked down at the bag in my hands, I realized one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had started in the rain had not ended when I walked away. It had only just begun, and somewhere out there, he was still watching, still deciding, and he had not looked away. I did not open the bag right away, not because I thought it was dangerous, but because something about it felt deliberate, like once I looked inside, I would not be able to pretend this was all just coincidence anymore. So I stood there for a moment longer with my back against the door, listening to the fading footsteps in the hallway until they disappeared completely, leaving me alone with the quiet and the weight of something I did not ask for. And slowly, carefully, I moved to the small kitchen counter and set the bag down like it might tell me something if I gave it enough time. But it just sat there, ordinary, unassuming, and that almost made it worse, because nothing about this situation was ordinary. Nothing about him was. And yet here I was staring at a simple paper bag like it held answers I was not ready to face. So I took a breath, steadying myself, and opened it, the soft rustle of paper louder than it should have been in the silence. And inside there was no note, no explanation, just a neatly folded sweater, dark gray, soft to the touch, the kind of quality you notice immediately even if you do not know brands or prices. And for a second I just stared at it, confused, because it did not make sense. Why this? Why now? Why me? Until I realized, my mind jumping back to the night before, to the rain soaking through my clothes, to the way I had been shivering without really noticing it at the time, and something tightened in my chest at the thought that he had noticed that, too. Something so small, so insignificant compared to everything else, and yet it had stayed with him long enough to act on it. And I did not know what to do with that, because it was not grand or overwhelming. It was quiet, intentional, almost careful, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to push away. So I picked it up, running my fingers over the fabric like it might reveal something more, but it did not. It was just a sweater, just something warm, something practical, and still it felt like more, like a message without words, and I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, setting it down again as I tried to make sense of everything. Because this crossed a line, a clear one, the kind that separates strangers from something else. Something closer, something I was not sure I wanted, and yet I could not ignore the way it made me feel. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, like I was being seen in a way I was not used to, in a way that made it impossible to stay invisible, and I pressed my hands against the counter, grounding myself in the cool surface as my thoughts circled back to him, to the way he had stood there, calm and certain, to the way he had asked that question like it mattered, and I realized something then that I had been avoiding, something that settled into place with quiet certainty. This was not about the man on the bench anymore. It was not even about the moment we shared on the street. It was about me, about what I represented in a world he clearly understood better than I did. And that realization should have made me step back, should have made me draw a line and hold it. But instead I found myself doing the opposite, reaching for the sweater again, holding it a little tighter this time, like I was testing the weight of a decision I had not fully made yet. And I did not put it away. I did not hide it in the back of a closet or pretend it did not exist. I left it there, draped over the back of a chair where I could see it, where I would not forget, because part of me knew that forgetting was not an option anymore, not after this, not after him. And as I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, the city humming faintly beyond the walls, I realized something else, something that settled deeper than the rest. He had not just noticed what I did, he had noticed me. Every detail, every small thing I had not even realized mattered, and he was responding in ways I could not predict, ways that felt controlled and intentional. And that meant this was not random, it was not accidental, it was a choice, his choice. And the question that lingered, heavier than anything else, was not why he was doing this, but what he was going to do next. Because one thing was clear now in a way it had not been before. He was not looking away, and neither was I. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind would not slow down. Every time I closed my eyes I saw his face, the way he watched, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he seemed to notice things I barely registered myself. And when morning came, pale light slipping through the thin curtains of my apartment, I found myself already awake, sitting at the edge of my bed with the sweater folded neatly beside me like proof that none of this had been imagined. And for a moment I considered leaving it behind, walking out the door and pretending everything had stayed simple, that I was still just a girl who worked long shifts and minded her own business. But my hand moved before my thoughts could stop it, reaching for the fabric, pulling it over my head, and the warmth settled around me instantly, soft and unfamiliar in a way that made me pause, because it fit perfectly, not too loose, not too tight, like it had been chosen with intention, like he had known. And that realization sent a quiet shiver through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. So I grabbed my bag and left before I could overthink it, stepping into the cool morning air with a sense that something had already changed, something I could not take back even if I wanted to. And the walk to work felt different this time, not because the streets had changed, but because I was aware of them in a new way. Every reflection in a window, every passing car, every figure standing just a little too still, and I told myself it was nothing, just the after effect of a strange night. But part of me knew better, part of me understood that once someone like him notices you, the world does not go back to how it was before. And when I reached the coffee shop, pushing open the door as the familiar bell chimed overhead, I forced myself into routine, tying my apron, greeting customers, focusing on the simple, predictable rhythm of orders and payments, because that was safe, that was normal, and for a while it worked, until it did not. Until the door opened again, and the room shifted in that subtle, unmistakable way that I was already starting to recognize. And I did not look up right away this time. I did not want to. I wanted to finish what I was doing, to stay in control of something, anything, but I felt it. Anyway, that quiet pull, and when I finally raised my eyes, he was there, standing in the same spot as yesterday, calm, composed, like nothing about this was unusual for him, like showing up again was the most natural thing in the world, and for a second neither of us spoke, the noise of the shop filling the space between us, until I broke first, because I needed to, because silence with him felt too heavy. You came back, I said, my voice steady but softer than I intended, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not quite approval, just acknowledgement. So did you, he replied, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because he was right. I had come back too, to the same place, the same routine, the same version of myself that was starting to feel less certain by the minute, and I swallowed, glancing down at the counter for just a second before meeting his gaze again, refusing to look away this time, because I was beginning to understand that looking away would not change anything. Coffee? I asked, even though I already knew the answer, and he gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving mine. Black, he said, the word low and deliberate, and I turned to prepare it, my movements automatic, but my thoughts anything but, because I could feel his attention the entire time, steady, focused, like he was studying something only he could see. And when I handed him the cup, our fingers did not touch this time, but the distance between us felt just as charged, just as intentional, and I hesitated for a second before speaking again, because the question had been sitting in my chest since the moment I woke up. Why are you doing this? I asked quietly, and for the first time, he did not answer right away, his gaze shifting slightly, not away from me, but deeper, like he was choosing his words carefully, like the answer mattered more than the question, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, certain, and impossible to ignore. Because you did something no one else did, he said, and the words landed heavier than I expected, not because they were complicated, but because they were not, because they were simple and true, in a way that left no room for doubt, and I felt my breath catch just slightly as I held his gaze, understanding settling in piece by piece. And that matters? I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer, and he gave the smallest shake of his head, not dismissive, just clear. It matters to me, he said, and that was it. No explanation, no justification, just a statement that felt final in a way I could not argue with. And as he turned to leave again, stepping back into the world outside without another word, I stood there for a moment longer, the cup still warm in my hands, my heart beating just a little faster than before, because I realized something I had not fully accepted until now. This was not random. This was not temporary. This was a choice he was continuing to make, and every time he showed up, every time he looked at me like that, he was reinforcing it. And the part that unsettled me the most was not that he had noticed me. It was that I was starting to notice him too, in ways I could not ignore, in ways that were already beginning to change everything. I tried to tell myself it was just routine now, that his presence had become something predictable, something I could file away with the rest of my day and not let it affect me. But that was not true, not even close, because every time he walked into that shop, every time the air shifted in that quiet, unmistakable way, something inside me reacted before I could stop it, something that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with awareness. And by the third day, I noticed something else, something I could not ignore anymore. It was not just him who had changed the way the room felt. It was everything around him. The way conversations lowered slightly without anyone realizing why. The way people stepped aside just a fraction earlier than necessary. The way my manager, who never hesitated to correct anyone, suddenly chose silence when he passed by. And that was when it truly settled in. The realization that whatever world he came from, it was not just different, it was powerful in ways I did not fully understand. And that understanding should have made me pull back, should have made me create distance. But instead it did the opposite. It made me pay closer attention, because I wanted to know, I needed to know what kind of person moved through the world like that, and still chose to notice something as small as what I had done. And that question followed me long after my shift ended, long after I stepped back onto the street, the sky already dimming into early evening as the city lights flickered on one by one, and I walked the same path as always, telling myself nothing had changed even as I knew that everything had. and when I reached the corner near the bus stop again, I slowed without meaning to, my eyes drifting toward the familiar bench out of habit more than intention, and this time there was someone there, not the man from before, but a younger woman, sitting hunched over with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her shoulders trembling in a way that was easy to miss if you were not looking for it. And people were doing exactly that, not looking, walking past like they always did, like they had somewhere more important to be, and I felt that same pull again, that same moment of hesitation where I could choose to keep walking or choose to stop, and I already knew what I was going to do before I even fully thought about it. So I stepped off the curb and crossed the short distance to the bench, ignoring the way my heart picked up slightly, not from fear, but from the awareness that this was becoming a pattern, something I could not pretend was accidental anymore. "Hey," I said softly, crouching down just enough to meet her eye level without overwhelming her, and she looked up slowly, her expression guarded, uncertain, like she expected something else from me, something less kind, and I recognized that look immediately because I had seen it before. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, simple, giving her space to answer or nod. And for a moment she did not say anything, just studied me like she was trying to decide if I was real, if this was real, and then she nodded slightly, even though it was clear she was not, and I let out a quiet breath, reaching into my bag again. The same motion as before, familiar now, and I handed her the bottle of water I had grabbed on my way out of work, pressing it gently into her hand the same way I had done before, and as her fingers closed around it, something shifted again, that subtle, unmistakable feeling I had come to recognize, and I did not have to look to know what it meant, but I did anyway, slowly, almost reluctantly, my gaze lifting across the street where the black SUV sat once more, parked in nearly the exact same spot as before, like it had never left, like it had been waiting for this exact moment, and my breath caught just slightly as I met the reflection in the dark glass, because I knew he was there. I knew he was watching, not the situation, not the city, but me, specifically me, and this time I did not look away, not immediately. I held that invisible line for just a second longer than before, long enough to acknowledge it, to accept it, and something inside me settled with quiet certainty, because I realized this was not just about being seen anymore. It was about being understood in a way I had not asked for but could not deny. And when I finally looked back at the woman in front of me, offering a small, reassuring smile that felt more grounded than before, I knew that whatever this was, whatever he was doing, it was not going to stop me from doing the same. And maybe that was the part he had already figured out, the part that made him keep coming back. Because in a world where everyone else walked away, I did not, and now there was someone who stayed long enough to see it happen again, and again, and again, and he still had not looked away. By the time I stood up from the bench, the city felt quieter than it should have been, not because the noise had disappeared, but because my focus had narrowed, everything else fading into the background except the weight of that presence across the street, steady and unchanging. And I did not rush this time. I did not pretend it was not there. I simply took a breath, gave the woman one last reassuring nod, and stepped back onto the sidewalk, my eyes lifting without hesitation toward the dark reflection of the SUV, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was being watched from a distance. It felt closer than that, intentional, like the space between us had already been measured and understood, and something in me shifted with that realization, something that felt less like uncertainty and more like acceptance. So instead of turning away, instead of continuing down my usual path, I crossed the street, each step deliberate, each second stretching just enough for me to feel the weight of the decision I was making, because this was no longer something happening around me. This was something I was stepping into, and when I reached the curb on the other side, the SUV was right there, close enough that I could see the faint outline of movement behind the tinted glass. And for a moment, I just stood there, my reflection staring back at me, layered over whatever existed inside. And then the back door opened smoothly, almost silently, like it had been waiting for this exact moment, and I hesitated for half a second, not out of fear, but because crossing that threshold felt different, final in a way I could not fully explain. And then I stepped forward, leaning down just enough to look inside, and there he was, exactly as I expected, exactly as I remembered, sitting with the same calm presence that seemed to shape the space around him. his gaze already on me, steady, focused, like I had not just approached him, but arrived exactly where he knew I would. And for a second neither of us spoke. The city continuing around us like this moment did not exist, like this line between two completely different worlds was not being crossed in real time. And then I broke the silence, because I needed to understand. You were going to stay there all night again, were you not? I asked, my voice quieter now, less defensive, more certain, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but real, like he recognized the change in me just as clearly as I felt it. If that is what it took, he replied, his tone even, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the words settle deeper than they should have. And I let out a small breath, shaking my head slightly, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement. Because I was starting to understand the pattern, the intention behind it. Why? I asked again, stepping a little closer without realizing it, my hand resting lightly against the edge of the door, grounding myself in the moment. And this time he did not answer immediately, his gaze holding mine as if measuring the question itself, as if deciding how much to reveal. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. Because you keep doing it, he said, and I frowned slightly. Not because I did not understand, but because I wanted him to say it clearly. Doing what? I asked, and his eyes did not leave mine, not even for a second. Stopping, he said simply, and the word hit harder than I expected, because it was true, because it was exactly what I had been doing without thinking, without calculating, without considering the consequences, and I swallowed, my grip on the door tightening just slightly as the realization settled in. That is not a reason, I said quietly, even though part of me already knew it was, and he leaned forward just enough to close the distance between us, not enough to invade, just enough to make the moment feel contained, intentional. In my world, he said, his voice steady. People notice power, money, fear. He paused briefly, like the words themselves carried weight he was choosing to control. You notice people. And for a second, everything else disappeared. The noise, the movement, the distance between where I had been and where I was now. All of it fading into the background as that statement settled into place. Clear and undeniable. And I felt my breath catch, not from surprise, but from the way it resonated, the way it reflected something I had never thought to define before. And I held his gaze, no longer looking away, no longer pretending this was something I could ignore, because it was not. It had not been for a while. And as the silence stretched between us again, this time it felt different, not uncertain, not tense, but full, like something had finally been acknowledged on both sides, and I realized then that this was the moment everything shifted, not because he had noticed me, but because I had chosen to step closer instead of away, and whatever came next, whatever this connection meant in a world I did not fully understand, one thing was certain now in a way it had not been before. He had not looked away, and neither had I. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand still resting against the door, the world narrowing down to the space between his words and the quiet way they settled into me. And I realized something I had not fully admitted until now. I was no longer trying to leave. I was trying to understand, and that changed everything. So I took a slow breath and stepped back slightly, not away from him, just enough to see him clearly, to take in the details I had been too focused to notice before, the precision in the way he carried himself, the stillness that did not feel passive but controlled, like every movement was a choice. And it made me wonder how someone like that could exist in a world so chaotic and still find something worth noticing in something as simple as stopping for a stranger. What happens now? I asked quietly, not because I expected a simple answer, but because the question had been building since the moment I first saw him watching from across the street, and he did not respond immediately, his gaze steady as if weighing not just the question, but me. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, certain in a way that left no room for doubt. That depends on you, he said, and I felt my brows draw together slightly, because that was not what I expected, not from someone who seemed so used to control, on me. I repeated, and he gave a slight nod. You can walk away, he continued, the words simple, almost neutral, but carrying an undercurrent that made them feel heavier, more deliberate. And I will not stop you. And for a second the world seemed to pause, not because of what he said, but because of what he did not say, because there was something unspoken in the space between those words, Something that made it clear that while he would not stop me, that did not mean he would disappear, and I swallowed, glancing down for just a second before looking back up, because I knew the truth already. I had known at the moment I crossed the street instead of walking away. And if I do not? I asked, my voice steadier now, more certain than I felt, and something shifted in his expression again, subtle but unmistakable, like this was the answer he had been waiting for. Then you do not have to wonder who is watching, he said, and the words settled into me in a way I could not ignore, not threatening, not overwhelming, just clear, like a line drawn between what my life had been and what it could become if I stepped any further into his world. And I let out a slow breath, my heart beating just a little faster as I considered it. Not the danger, not the unknown, but the certainty behind his presence, the way he did not look away, the way he noticed things no one else did. And I realized that was what mattered, not the difference between our worlds, but the fact that in a city full of people who chose not to see, he had chosen to see me, and I had chosen not to turn away from that. So I met his gaze fully. No hesitation left, no doubt I could hide behind. I do not think I was ever going to walk away, I said, the truth settling between us with a quiet finality. And for the first time, something close to approval flickered in his eyes, not overwhelming, not obvious, but there, and it made something in my chest tighten in a way I could not quite explain, because it felt like a beginning more than anything else, like the first step into something I did not fully understand but was no longer afraid of. And he leaned back slightly, the tension in the moment easing, just enough to feel like a shift rather than an ending. Then you should know, he said, his voice just as controlled as before. Once you are seen, you are not forgotten. And I held his gaze as the meaning settled in, deeper than the words themselves, because it was not a warning, not exactly. It was a truth, one that carried both weight and promise, and I nodded slightly, not because I had all the answers, but because I understood enough to move forward, enough to accept what this meant, without pretending it was something simple. And as I stepped back from the door, giving space but not distance, I realized something that felt clearer than anything else since this all began. The world had not changed. People would still pass by, still choose not to see what was right in front of them. But I would not. I never had. And now there was someone else who chose the same in his own way. Someone who had watched, waited, and decided I was worth noticing. And as the door of the SUV closed softly between us, the city continuing on like nothing had shifted at all, I understood the truth that had been building from the very beginning. Everyone else kept walking, but I stopped. And that was the moment everything changed, because he noticed, and he never looked away.